My father built his empire with a surveyor's level, a used pickup truck, and a stubborn refusal to ever die poor. His widow began tearing it apart before the flowers on his casket had even wilted. My name is Thomas Livingston. I'm 35. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and for most of my life, I believed family was the one thing you never had to put in writing. I believed trust was supposed to come naturally between people who shared your blood. I was wrong. It took me 48 hours of grief, 3 weeks of silence, and one unforgettable moment in a courtroom to learn that lesson. But to understand how it happened, you need to know where my father came from. Robert Livingston built Livingston General Contractors from the ground up. He started with a used pickup, a $12,000 loan from my grandfather, and a commercial construction license he studied for while working night shifts as a framing carpenter. When I was born in 1989, he had 4 employees. By the time I reached middle school, there were 42. And when I graduated from Arizona State University in 2011 with a civil engineering degree, Livingston General Contractors had become a respected commercial construction company based in North Phoenix, handling projects across Maricopa and Pinal counties. We had our own equipment, 2 yards, a strong reputation with government contracts, and nearly 110 employees depending on us for their paychecks. My father never cared about looking rich. He drove the same Ford F-250 for 12 years, wore Wranglers and work boots into business meetings, and never once apologized for either. He could spot a bluff from across a room, shook hands like his word meant something, and slept 8 hours every night. A tired man makes bad decisions, he used to say. But for all his discipline, my father had one weakness. He fell in love twice. My mother, Carol Livingston, died from a brain aneurysm in January 2003. I was 13. My father took it the way strong men often do, quietly. He never broke down in front of me, but more than once I woke up at 2 in the morning and heard him sitting alone in the kitchen, the radio barely loud enough to hear. He never talked about his grief. He just carried it. 4 years later, in 2007, he met Sandra Pewitt. She was 31, recently divorced, and working as an office manager for a commercial real estate brokerage in Scottsdale. She was polished, intelligent, and easy to like at first. She had a way of being warm without ever becoming familiar, the kind of person who could make you feel welcome while keeping you at arm's length. My father was 60 that year. He had retired from the field, and beneath all his success, he was lonely. The kind of loneliness men from his generation rarely admitted out loud. They married in 2009. Sandra became Sandra Livingston. She was 33. My father was 62. I was 20 and already at ASU, watching the whole thing from a careful distance. I tried to like her. I really did. Sandra was never openly cruel to me, which somehow made it harder to explain why I never felt wanted around her. She was always polite, always pleasant, always distant. She treated me like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, not badly enough to complain, but never warmly enough to feel at home. Every conversation with Sandra had a line you could feel but never see. Holidays came with polite smiles and attention that never quite left the room. Whenever I came home for a weekend, she would somehow find a reason to disappear for the first few hours, then return just in time to make it seem like nothing had happened. My father never confronted it. Maybe he never noticed. Maybe he did and loved her too much to admit it. I spent years wondering which answer was worse. By 2019, I had been working at Livingston General for 6 years as a project manager, while my father had started taking Friday afternoons off. Around the same time, Sandra had quietly worked her way into the center of the company. She knew nothing about engineering or construction, but she had made herself responsible for payroll administration, vendor relationships, and accounts receivable. She had a salary, a company credit card, and her own desk 3 days a week. My father was proud of her. He told his friends she had really stepped up. I wasn't convinced. I started noticing little things that didn't add up. One vendor invoice was higher than it should have been. A payroll entry carried a name I didn't recognize. Mileage reimbursements listed routes that didn't match any of our job sites. In October 2021, I finally brought it up with my father. I was careful. I framed it as a routine financial audit, not an accusation against his wife. He listened across the kitchen table, then looked at me with tired eyes. Thomas, I'm 64 years old. I'm not going to spend whatever time I've got left auditing my own marriage. I dropped it. I wish I hadn't. In early 2022, my father was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. His cardiologist told him the combination of arrhythmia and arterial blockage was a clock he couldn't turn back. He underwent surgery and recovered, but he never returned to the pace he'd kept for most of his life. He talked about retiring constantly and somehow never did. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, my father died at home. He was 67. Sandra was beside him when it happened. The call came at 6:47 a.m. I drove from my house in Tempe to North Phoenix so fast I barely remember the drive. My father looked peaceful when I saw him. Whatever happens after death, he looked like a man who had finally set down a burden he'd been carrying for years. I stood beside his bed and stared at him, trying to accept that he was gone. In the kitchen, Sandra was already on the phone with the funeral home, speaking in a low, controlled voice, efficient, businesslike. I noticed it, then immediately told myself I was being unfair because I was grieving. The funeral was held that Friday. Family came, employees came, subcontractors came. City officials who had worked with my father for years filled the room. Men in work boots stood beside women in black dresses, all mourning the same man who had built something that would outlive him. Sandra sat in the front row. She cried when people expected her to cry, thanked everyone during the reception, and moved through the day with the same composure I'd always seen from her. 2 days later, on Sunday morning, an email landed in my inbox. It came from a Scottsdale estate attorney named Gerald Marsh. He represented Sandra Livingston. I opened it expecting paperwork. Instead, I read a sentence that made my stomach drop. According to my father's most recent will, signed in November 2023, Sandra was the sole beneficiary of his estate, the house, the financial accounts, and every single share of Livingston General Contractors, LLC. Then came the part that made it clear this wasn't a simple inheritance. The attorney gave me 5 business days to contact his office and arrange a time to collect whatever personal belongings I wanted from my father's home. That was it. My father had spent 40 years building an empire. I had spent 6 years helping run it. And according to one document, I had just become a guest in the house where I grew up. In other words, my father was barely in the ground before Sandra was telling me to collect my belongings and leave. I read the email 4 times at my kitchen table. For about 30 seconds. I was furious. Then the anger disappeared. What replaced it was something I knew well from years on: construction sites, and the moment when a problem stops being emotional and becomes a problem you have to solve. I poured myself another coffee and called my attorney, Kevin Mercer. Kevin was 49, a business and estate litigation attorney in downtown Phoenix, and he'd represented my father for more than a decade. Corporate structures, contractor disputes, acquisitions if it involved the company, Kevin had probably handled it. More importantly, he had drafted my father's estate documents. He answered on the second ring. Thomas, I was expecting your call. Are you okay? I'm functional. Tell me what you know about a will dated November 2023. There was a long pause. Before you do anything, come to my office tomorrow morning. There are some things you need to see in person. I didn't ask questions. I barely slept that night. At 8:30 the next morning, I walked into Kevin's office on North Central Avenue. He was already waiting behind his desk with a stack of documents and 2 cups of coffee. He didn't waste time. Your father came to me in September 2023, he said. He was worried. He'd started finding discrepancies in the company accounts that he couldn't explain. He wanted to restructure the business. I stared at him. He came to you before he came to me? He didn't want to alarm you. At that point, he had suspicions, not proof. Kevin pushed a folder across the desk. Your father trusted his instincts, Thomas. He had good reason to. What my father had done over the following 6 weeks was something Sandra never saw coming. With Kevin's help, he completely reorganized the ownership structure of Livingston General Contractors. His personal ownership in the company was transferred into the Robert H. Livingston Family Trust, along with a separate holding entity designed to control the company's actual assets. Kevin became the trustee responsible for the business structure. The person named to take over operational control was Thomas Allen Livingston, me. Then Kevin explained the part that made Sandra's attorney's email almost laughable. The November 2023 will was real. My father had signed it. It did leave Sandra the family home and his personal financial accounts, which were substantial. It also left her 100% of Livingston General Contractors, LLC. On paper, it looked like she'd inherited the entire company. But there was one problem. By the time my father signed that will, Livingston General Contractors, LLC was practically worthless. The company itself had become an empty shell. 2 months earlier, my father had legally transferred everything that actually mattered into the holding structure controlled by the trust. The equipment fleet, the 2 yards, the active contracts, the operating accounts, the licenses, the employees, the receivables, the company's goodwill, all of it. Sandra had been handed the name of the company. My father had already moved the company itself. I looked down at the documents in front of me, then back at Kevin. For the first time since my father's funeral, I understood what his silence had meant. He hadn't ignored the warning signs. He had been investigating them. And while Sandra was positioning herself to inherit his empire, my father had quietly moved the entire empire somewhere she couldn't touch it. Kevin looked at me across his desk. Sandra is going to fight this. Gerald Marsh is competent. He'll argue your father transferred the assets to the trust to defeat Sandra's inheritance rights. Can he win? Not easily. The restructuring was legitimate, and we have a paper trail showing your father had business reasons for doing it. The financial discrepancies, the restructuring documents, the timing, we can defend all of it. Arizona law gives a surviving spouse certain rights to the augmented estate, but the evidence makes their argument difficult. He paused, then leaned forward. But I don't want you to fight this. I frowned. What do you mean? Give her everything. I stared at him. Everything? The house, the personal accounts, the LLC, all of it, exactly as the November will says. I waited for the catch. Kevin gave me a faint smile. Then let Gerald Marsh open the books of the LLC. I understood immediately. That was the plan. We wouldn't challenge Sandra's inheritance. We would make sure she received exactly what she believed she'd won. I drove home that evening and sat on my patio with a beer, watching the sun disappear behind the South Mountain Range. Phoenix sunsets don't apologize for anything. They just burn across the sky and disappear. I thought about my father, his old F-250, his Thursday breakfasts at the same diner, and the way he'd trusted his instincts even when everyone else told him he was overthinking things. I've got it from here, Dad, I said quietly. 3 days after the funeral, Sandra finally texted me. She had never been the kind of person who checked on me unless she had a reason. The message was short. Thomas, I'd appreciate it if we could handle this like adults. Gerald will be in touch. I read it twice, turned my phone face down, and made breakfast. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, the same breakfast my father used to make every Saturday morning. I still made it the way he taught me: no butter, high heat, patience. Some habits don't disappear just because the person who gave them to you does. The following Wednesday, Gerald Marsh called Kevin. That afternoon, Kevin sent me a voice message explaining what had been said. Gerald made Sandra's position very clear. The November 2023 will was valid. Sandra was the sole beneficiary. She expected immediate control of everything named in it, including Livingston General Contractors, LLC. He also made it clear that if I tried to challenge the will or bring up the trust, they would take me to court. He used the phrase scorched earth twice, Kevin told me, which is interesting, considering he's about to walk into a fire. Kevin's response was simple. Thomas Livingston has no intention of contesting the will. He will comply with every term. All LLC interests will be transferred to Sandra Livingston, exactly as the document requires. There was a long silence on Gerald's end. Then he finally said, "Well, that's reasonable." He had expected a fight. Instead, we'd handed him exactly what he asked for. And he had no idea what was waiting inside that company. Thomas is a reasonable man, Kevin told Gerald. He just wants his father's wishes respected. After that call, I kept working. That might sound strange, but grief doesn't stop construction schedules, payroll, or deadlines. I missed my father constantly. I still reached for my phone when something happened at work, then remembered I couldn't call him anymore. But beneath the grief was something else. Clarity. My father hadn't left me helpless. He had seen what was coming and prepared for it. My job was simple. Finish what he started. In the weeks after the funeral, I continued going into the office. Doug Carver, our 43-year-old operations manager, had been with Livingston General for 11 years and knew about the restructuring. My father and Kevin had briefed him before the funeral. Doug handled the transition the way he handled everything else, quietly and without drama. The crews kept working. Projects stayed on schedule. Payroll went out on time. Nobody panicked because, from the outside, nothing had changed. That was exactly how my father had designed it. The trust structure kept the actual business completely separate from the estate Sandra was about to inherit. As far as she knew, she was taking control of Livingston General Contractors. She had no idea the company she thought she was inheriting was only a shell. I spoke to her once during those weeks. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late March. I was sitting in my truck outside a job site in Mesa, eating a sandwich and going over construction plans when my phone rang. It was Sandra. "Thomas," she said, using that careful, friendly voice she always used when she wanted something. "I just want you to know I don't want this to become adversarial. Your father loved you. I'd like us to move forward with some level of mutual respect." I almost laughed. "I think that's a reasonable goal. Gerald tells me your attorney has agreed to the transfer." "That's right. I appreciate that, Thomas. Truly. Your father's wishes were clear, and I'm not going to stand in the way of that." She went quiet for a moment. I could hear her thinking. She was trying to figure out whether I was accepting defeat or simply didn't understand what was happening. "I think we can still have a relationship," she said. "We're family." "Of course," I replied. Then the call ended. I finished my sandwich and looked through the windshield at the heat shimmering above the asphalt. The air smelled like concrete, diesel, and machine exhaust, the smell that had surrounded my childhood. It reminded me of my father's hands, his truck, and every job site where I'd watched him work. 4 days later, Sandra would stop calling me family. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early April 2024 at Maricopa County Superior Court in downtown Phoenix. And that was where Sandra was finally going to learn what she'd actually inherited. Kevin had already filed the paperwork for the voluntary transfer of the LLC interests. No objections, no contest, no fight. Exactly what Sandra's attorney had demanded. I wore a gray blazer, dark jeans, and the kind of shoes my father would have called good enough for court. At 8:15 that morning, I parked downtown and walked toward the courthouse under the rising Phoenix sun. Kevin was waiting outside the hearing room with his associate, Paula Webb. Paula had helped build the trust structure with Kevin and had spent months reviewing every possible challenge. She carried a folder under one arm and looked completely relaxed. Sandra arrived at 8:40 with Gerald Marsh. She wore a black blazer and pearl earrings, dressed like a woman, about to take possession of something valuable. Gerald looked exactly like the kind of attorney who charged by the minute and expected everyone in the room to know it. He greeted Kevin, placed his briefcase on the table, and sat down. The hearing itself was routine. No jury, no drama. Just a judge, a court officer, attorneys, and an estate being transferred. The judge reviewed the November 2023 will, confirmed its validity, and then turned to Kevin. "Does your client object to the transfer?" "No, Your Honor." "Mr. Livingston agrees to the transfer in full." Sandra leaned back slightly. Gerald's shoulders relaxed. He had come expecting a fight and suddenly realized there wouldn't be one. The judge signed the order approving the transfer. Sandra had officially received the company, or at least she thought she had. Then Gerald opened the business asset schedule. It was a standard document required before the transfer could be finalized. He turned to the first page, then the second. Then he stopped. I watched his expression change. His eyes moved across the page again. He blinked, turned back to the previous page, and read it twice. Then he looked at Kevin. Kevin didn't move. Gerald looked down again. The line that had stopped him was simple. It listed the net asset value of Livingston General Contractors, LLC following the October 2023 restructuring, $0. For 4 seconds, nobody spoke. 4 seconds is a long time in a courtroom. Gerald slowly placed the document on the table. He took off his glasses, folded them, and set them beside the folder. Then he looked at Kevin again, fighting to keep his expression under control. "Counsel," he said carefully, "I'd like to request a brief recess." The judge granted it. Sandra immediately leaned toward Gerald. Her voice was low, but not low enough. "What does that mean? What's wrong? What does it say?" Sandra demanded. Gerald's voice became firm. "Not here." He guided her into the hallway while I stayed in my chair. Kevin poured himself a glass of water and handed me another. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm good." And for the first time since my father died, I meant it. Through the glass beside the hearing room, I watched Sandra's expression unravel. The composed widow who had thanked everyone at the funeral emailed me through an attorney and talked about moving forward as family was disappearing by the second. Gerald showed her the asset schedule. She read it. Her face changed from confusion to disbelief, then to something harder: anger. The kind that appears when someone realizes the game they thought they were winning ended before they even knew they were playing. Sandra stormed back into the room before Gerald could stop her. "What did you do?" She pointed directly at me. "What did you do to that company?" I looked at her. "I didn't do anything to the company, Sandra. My father did, 18 months ago. That's fraud. That's illegal. He stripped the assets from the estate." Kevin didn't raise his voice. "Your father restructured his business. He had every right to do so." Sandra turned toward him. "He did this to cut me out. He did it to protect the business," Kevin replied. "Whether you see those as the same thing is a matter of perspective." Gerald returned and placed a hand lightly on Sandra's arm. "Sandra, please." She sat down, breathing slowly, trying to contain herself. The judge returned, and the hearing continued. The transfer went through exactly as planned. Sandra received 100% of Livingston General Contractors, LLC. Every share, every legal document, every piece of paper attached to the company. But the company itself was empty. No employees, no contracts, no equipment, no property, no receivables, nothing but a corporate filing and a name. My father had built an empire and left Sandra the shell it had once occupied. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. This wasn't about humiliating her. It was about finishing what my father had started. He had prepared the move. All I had to do was show up. After the hearing, Kevin walked with me through the parking garage toward my truck. The April sun was already beating against the concrete. "She'll challenge the restructuring," he said. "Gerald will probably file within 30 days. Can he win?" "He can file. That's not the same thing." Kevin explained that Arizona law gave surviving spouses certain rights to an augmented estate, but that any challenge would have to account for the actual circumstances of the transfers. My father's restructuring had been completed months before the will was signed, and we documented the business reasons behind every move. Then there were the financial discrepancies my father had already uncovered. Kevin looked at me before adding one more thing. "Your father didn't just prepare for Sandra. He prepared for court. We have the vendor audit," Kevin said, "and we have a clean paper trail." I nodded. "If she pursues the elective share, what does she realistically walk away with?" "The family home, fully paid off, worth around $1 million in the current Phoenix market. Your father's personal accounts, roughly $400,000 after estate expenses. She could also make a claim against part of the marital share of the company's goodwill, but we'll fight that hard." Kevin paused. "She'll be comfortable, Thomas. She won't be destitute. I'm not trying to destroy her," I said. "I just won't let her take something that 110 people depend on." Kevin looked at me for a moment. "Your father said almost the exact same thing when he came to see me in September. That stayed with me. He had seen the same warning signs I had, the strange invoices, the access to company money, the way Sandra had slowly positioned herself closer and closer to anything valuable. He had simply handled it the way he handled everything else. Quietly, methodically, completely. Over the following weeks, Gerald filed the elective share claim just as Kevin predicted. The case became a real fight. There were depositions, document requests, financial reviews, and months of forensic accounting. Sandra hired an accountant to dig through the restructuring, hoping to find something that would prove my father had moved the assets illegally. We hired one too. And then they found something neither side had expected. The vendor invoices I'd flagged back in 2021, the ones my father had quietly started documenting. Once the forensic team traced the payments, a pattern emerged across 14 months of company records. Several vendors had submitted inflated invoices through a sole proprietorship with no verifiable physical address. The money eventually flowed into a Nevada LLC, and the account behind it had Sandra Livingston listed as the authorized signer. The total was $263,000. Kevin didn't use it as a threat. He filed the records with the court as evidence relevant to the estate and the elective share calculation. 11 days later, Gerald Marsh withdrew from the case. His filing cited a conflict of interest. Kevin read it and simply said, "That's the polite legal way of saying he doesn't want to be sitting in the room when this gets worse." Sandra hired another attorney, Beth Coulter, a sharp young lawyer from Tempe. Beth reviewed the evidence and immediately understood what Gerald had apparently failed to anticipate. Her client's position had collapsed. 3 weeks later, Beth called Kevin with a settlement proposal. Sandra would withdraw every elective share claim. She would keep the family residence and my father's personal accounts. In exchange, she would sign a full release, giving up any claim to the holding company, the family trust, or the operations of Livingston General Contractors. She would walk away with the house, hundreds of thousands in cash, and nothing else. For the first time since my father died, I had a choice to make. The settlement came with one final condition. The financial misconduct records would be treated as resolved and would not be referred to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Kevin brought the proposal to me on a Tuesday evening. We sat in his office while the lights came on across downtown Phoenix and traffic moved slowly along Central Avenue below us. "It's a clean resolution," he said. "Sandra walks away with substantial assets. You avoid a criminal referral that could drag on for years." "Does she deserve that?" I asked. Kevin looked at me. "Deserve is a theological question, Thomas. I'm a lawyer. What I can tell you is that this settlement protects the company, protects the employees, and closes the chapter." He was right. My father hadn't built the trust to punish Sandra. He built it to protect the business. I signed the settlement on a Wednesday morning in May 2024, 14 weeks after my father's funeral, and 11 weeks after an attorney had walked into a courtroom believing he was transferring an empire, only to discover he was transferring an empty shell. Afterward, I drove to a warehouse project in North Phoenix that Doug Carver had kept moving through the entire mess. The concrete had already been poured. Steel was rising on schedule. I parked and walked along the perimeter as workers moved beams 40 feet above the ground. "How's the project looking?" I called Doug over the radio. "Clean," he answered. "North elevation is exactly where we want it." "Good. Keep it moving." I stood there listening to the cranes, the engines, the steel, and the constant noise of men building something that was meant to outlast them. My father had stood on hundreds of job sites like this. Different cities, different decades. Same sound. Something taking shape. I finally understood that this was the inheritance he had actually left me. Not the money, not the house, not even the company itself. It was the way he thought. He was 67 when he died. During the final 18 months of his life, while his heart was failing and his body was slowing down, he still found the discipline to document what he saw, investigate what didn't make sense, bring in an attorney, restructure the business, and protect the people who depended on it. He didn't do it because he hated Sandra. He didn't do it because he wanted revenge. He did it because he was a builder. Builders think about what happens after they're gone. For years, I'd convinced myself that staying quiet was the same thing as being loyal. I didn't want to create conflict in my father's marriage. I didn't want to become the difficult son. I thought protecting my relationship with my father meant ignoring the things I didn't want to see. Now I understood the difference. Love doesn't mean blind trust. Loyalty doesn't mean refusing to check the numbers. You can love someone and still read the contract. You can respect a marriage and still verify the accounts. You can trust your family and still know exactly what belongs to you. My father learned that lesson late, but when he finally acted, he left nothing to chance. The business is still operating. The employees still have jobs. The projects are still moving forward. And every Saturday morning, I make the same breakfast my father used to make: scrambled eggs. Wheat toast. Black coffee. No butter. Just heat and patience. Because that's how my father built everything that lasted. And now it's my turn.